Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. John Sweller, Emeritus Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of New South Wales, and Oliver Caviglioli, who you may be familiar with from previous podcast appearances. I asked Oliver to join the conversation because he brings a unique perspective with his background and experience that I thought would add value to this conversation about cognitive load theory. And we tried to go beyond just telling you the basics of cognitive load theory into exploring the boundaries, challenges, and where it may need to go next. The aim here is to have the kinds of intellectually rigorous conversations that we hope educators are having with each other. And I really enjoyed and appreciated John's thinking and intellectual humility and Oliver's contribution as well. There were several more things I would have liked to discuss, especially the role of interest and motivation, but I wanted to be mindful and respectful of the time of everyone involved, and perhaps we can do that in a future conversation. Just a reminder that you can learn more about our professional learning options and services, which we focus through the lens of knowledge-rich inquiry at wegrowteachers.com. I'll also note that our PBL Grow 26 Summer Learning event is in early bird registration through the end of February, and it looks like we're likely to reach our cohort limit of 40 very soon. When we do, we'll open a waiting list for a second cohort, but I encourage you to register sooner rather than later if you'd like to secure your spot. All of that and much more is at wegrowteachers.com. This conversation started by unpacking the foundations of cognitive load theory with an explanation of cognitive architecture and the critical distinction between biologically primary and secondary knowledge. Oliver raised the issue of the transient effect and how the written word can help with that. We also talked about worked examples, the split attention effect, and desirable difficulties, in particular, contextual interference. That led us to the concept of element interactivity, how the complexity of information helps us determine the most effective instructional approach. And we also discussed why and when the use of inquiry can be catastrophic for high complexity topics, but useful for others. Other things we talked about include the redundancy effect and the importance of building a deep knowledge base in long-term memory as the essential foundation for complex skills like critical thinking and creativity. I hope this conversation helps you think more deeply about the complexities of teaching and learning. And now here's my conversation with John Sweller and Oliver Caviglioli. I am here with Oliver Caviglioli and John Sweller. We're going to talk about cognitive load theory, as John Sweller is the name most associated with that. And I want to give both Oliver and John an opportunity to say hello and introduce themselves. Oliver has been a part of the podcast before. He's joining from London, so maybe just a quick intro, Oliver, and then we'll get to John and unpack cognitive load theory a little bit.
Okay, I was a special school principal, head teacher for a decade. Spent most of my life teaching in there, and with my kind of architect design background, I found an obvious way to use those skills, and now applying them to mainstream learning, and with the constant reference of cognitive load theory as a framework with which to pin those experiences on. I'm keen to probe a couple of issues, boundary around certain principles.
Yeah, and John is joining us from Australia. So welcome, John. Thanks for joining us and giving us your time and your brain a little bit here. Hopefully not all of it. And so give us the intro and sort of some of the relevant info for folks who may not be interested or not interested in familiar with you. And hopefully they're interested in you, and maybe unpack cognitive load theory, just sort of the basics.
Okay, I'm an Emeritus Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. I started working on cognitive load theory, it must be about half a century ago now. It's been a long time, and the theory has progressed largely because of the many wonderful colleagues who I have had working with me. The theory is based on our understanding of human cognitive architecture, how we learn, how we think, how we solve problems. And our knowledge of that architecture has really developed quite substantially over the last few years. We were aware of certain aspects of that architecture, or have been aware of certain aspects of that architecture for a long time, but there have been newer aspects that have become apparent, and the way in which the architecture is, way in which the aspects of the architecture are connected has become much clearer, literally in the last 10, 15 years. So let me try to briefly describe that architecture. There are a series of aspects associated with it. First thing we need to do is consider categories of information. Now, you can categorize information in a near infinite number of ways, and most of those categorization schemes don't really have much relevance to instructional design, but there's one categorization scheme which was demonstrated to us by David Geary in the United States, and he distinguished between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge. Some information is information we have evolved to acquire over countless generations, and we can acquire that information effortlessly and unconsciously and without instruction. The clearest example of that is learning how to listen and speak one's native language. We're not taught most of the critical aspects of learning to listen and speak. To give you an example, we don't have classes in which students are taught how to organize their mouth, their lips, their tongue, their breath, their voice in order to speak their native language. It's an immensely complicated task. Most of us would have no clue how to teach it. Some special education teachers may need to teach aspects of it, but most classroom teachers don't need to teach that. Yeah. And that's just as well because it's immensely complex. That's a biologically primary skill. We've evolved to learn our first language. Biologically secondary skill is pretty much everything that's taught in a normal classroom. We invented education and classrooms in order to teach biologically secondary skills, because biologically secondary skills tend not to be acquired unless they're explicitly taught. That's why we invented education. So just about anything that's taught in a school is biologically secondary. And to give you an example that relates to the previous example of learning how to listen and speak, learning how to read and write. We don't learn how to read and write automatically in the way we learn to listen and speak. It needs to be taught. And that means we need an instructional design or instructional design procedures which allow us to teach biologically secondary information, and cognitive load theory for that reason is concerned with biologically secondary information. Learning to read and write, learning arithmetic, learning everything all the way up to the various topics that are taught in tertiary institutions. So let's continue. So that's the first aspect of human cognitive architecture we need to keep in mind. We're dealing with biologically secondary knowledge. Secondly, how do we acquire that knowledge? Well, there are two ways we can acquire biologically secondary knowledge. We can acquire it either by problem solving, working things out for ourselves, and that's the only way we can learn that sort of material if society in general doesn't know what's being taught, what needs to be taught. If society in general knows, then the best way to acquire that information is not by problem solving. It's by doing exactly what we're doing right here and now. Transmission from other members of society. So we can acquire information either by working it out for ourselves, by problem solving, or by obtaining the information from other people. And we have gone through something like 2 or 3 generations of educators who insisted that the best way of learning was via problem solving. And that simply is foolish. The easiest way we have of acquiring information is from other people. The only time we need to problem solve is if either other people have not yet worked out what it is that needs to be worked out, or alternatively, if they have worked it out, we don't have access to those people. In that case, you need to problem solve. The easiest, quickest way of learning anything is by obtaining the information from other people. Be wary of anyone who insists, don't tell kids this, let them work it out for themselves. They'll learn it much better. They won't. It'll take a long time to learn. It'll be difficult to learn. But we can acquire information literally in a few minutes that would otherwise take years to acquire via problem solving, and in some cases have taken years to acquire via problem solving. So provide students, as a teacher, provide students with information explicitly, clearly, in organized fashion. Next aspect of human cognitive architecture. Once students need to acquire that information, and they will acquire it via a structure called working memory, which has 2 peculiar characteristics. The first characteristic is it's extremely limited in capacity when dealing with novel information. When dealing with novel information, working memory can hold no more than about 7 items of information. It can process about 2, 3, maybe 4 items of information, where processing means putting it together, considering it, dealing with it. Very, very limited in capacity when dealing with novel information. And keep in mind, I'm talking about novel information, and of course it's novel information that education deals with.
Yes.
Second limitation of working memory is it can hold that information for no more than about 18 seconds. After that, it goes, just disappears. You can keep it in working memory for indefinite periods by repeating it to yourself. If you don't repeat it to yourself, it'll just go within a few seconds. So working memory when dealing with novel information, and it's novel information that teachers tend to be dealing with when they're transmitting it to students. Working memory can hold that information, only limited amounts of that information, for only a few seconds. So how do we learn anything? Well, the next step, the next aspect, or the next structure of human cognitive architecture that we need to discuss is long-term memory. we can transfer information from working memory into long-term memory. And long-term memory, unlike working memory, has no known limitations. If it has capacity limitations, we don't know where they are. If it has duration limitations, we don't know what the limitations are. Effectively, we can consider long-term memory as being unlimited in both capacity and duration. The last step of cognitive architecture. We can, once information has been stored in long-term memory, we can transfer it back into working memory. And at that point, a seeming miracle occurs, because working memory, when it's dealing with familiar information taken from long-term memory, has no known limitations. No capacity limitations that we know of, no duration limitations. I'll give you a simple example of that. Let's assume I show you a series of straight and curved lines, various sizes, various shapes, various orientations towards each other. Let's assume I show you several dozen of those lines. And I'll show them to you for, let's say, 2 or 3 seconds. Then I take them away and ask you to reproduce them. You could probably reproduce maybe 2 or 3 of them. The vast majority of them, you would say, oh, I can't possibly reproduce all that. That's silly. Let's assume those lines, nevertheless, spelt out the term long-term working memory in English, written out. Because that's what it consists of, a whole lot of massive lines. Show that to you 2 or 3 seconds and ask you, reproduce it. You'll get about 90–95% accuracy.
Can I give you an interesting parallel with that? I don't know whether you've heard this.
Yeah, please do.
And I can't find it. They looked at measures of working memory in different levels of expert draftsmen in drawing. And those that were more expert had greater capacity, because it would be the same thing. They knew the musculature of the arm, so that line all of a sudden relates to all that.
Exactly, that's exactly it.
I don't like to think of it in terms of those notions, but that's what they found. Fascinating.
Yep, that's exactly it. There's an interesting history to this. This phenomenon was first discovered in the late 1940s by a Dutch psychologist called de Groot.
Oh yes, the old chess.
Who was looking at the game of chess.
Yeah.
And he wanted to know why do chess grandmasters always win, and he couldn't find anything they were doing. They weren't looking ahead further moves. They weren't thinking a lot more. The only difference he could find showed a chessboard configuration taken from a real game to chess masters, asked them to reproduce it after they'd seen it for 2 or 3 seconds, and they could reproduce it at a level of about 90% accuracy. Did the same with weekend players. They could reproduce it with a level of about 20–25% accuracy. And that's the only difference between them. Chess grandmasters always win because every time they see any board configuration, it's a familiar configuration. They know that configuration. They know what move is associated with that configuration. They don't have to work out a good move. That's why they can defeat half a dozen or a dozen weekend players playing simultaneously against each one of them. How can they possibly remember where they are in each game? They can't and they don't. All that happens, they come to each board, they say, oh, okay, for that board configuration, this is the best move, and they make it. Long-term memory alters us.
Oh, what was interesting? very clever,
Yeah.
very clever follow-up when they switched all the pieces so it didn't have any meaning. And then memory was no better than anybody else, was it?
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you for reminding me of that. If you repeat the experiment by putting the pieces on the board in random configurations, there's no difference between grandmasters and weekend players. They both reproduce it at about 25% accuracy. And that's the same with the example of an English statement written to and shown to people who have learnt to read English. If the same statement was written out, say, in Chinese, and you couldn't read Chinese, you'd be like the weekend player looking at a board. What the hell is this? I don't know what it is. So it's look, we all know education is transformational, but this explains why.
Yeah.
Without knowledge held in long-term memory, we can do very little. Everything, all of our skills, including, I might add, critical thinking, creativity, the idea of having somebody engage in critical thinking and creativity without knowledge, it's hopeless. You can think critically, you can be creative, but only in areas where you have an enormous knowledge base. And that's why education transforms us. We become different people, but we become different people because of the knowledge we hold in long-term memory, and therefore the purpose of education is to assist students to acquire knowledge. That's what changes us. And that's the base for cognitive load theory. So that cognitive architecture I've just described provides the base for cognitive load theory. That base is used to generate hypotheses, which we test using randomized controlled experimental designs. And about 1.5 dozen various cognitive load theory effects, which have derived from that cognitive architecture. So I might stop my little spiel here now and continue on.
Yeah, there's so many threads to pull on, and thank you so much for that that description and sort of the pictures in my head. One quick question, and I am reminded that I talked with David Geary during COVID, and it was not about biologically primary or secondary, but something about the ruination of education due to COVID and all kinds of things. But that's a whole other conversation to have. You mentioned the biologically primary and secondary, and you used the example of speech, and I'm reminded of, I think her name is Kim Lockhart. Apologies if I got her first name wrong. I see her on social media all the time, and she does she's really she works with young kids and does teach them, she's doing the reading literacy, and I see these videos where she is doing some of that, really like teaching them how to form words and some of that, right? So I'm wondering, with those things, do you see any blurriness between the primary and secondary skills? If there's some overlap, some things that are, I guess, blurry, for lack of a better term, that are worth noting or describing?
Yeah, look, in a sense, all of the secondary skills rely on primary skills. The students that Oliver is dealing with in special education, those students have one deficit or another in the primary system, and in effect what Oliver is doing and what special education people are doing, they're attempting to compensate for those deficits using the secondary system, and because you can to a certain extent.
The curriculum in severe learning disability schools before the British national curriculum was called the developmental curriculum. And they based it on developmental milestones in increasingly granular detail, and then took the child's profile and matched and make sure they could, well, try to fit any gaps. And then by experience and guile and study, invent mixtures of direct and indirect and facilitative roles that would stimulate those natural urges to develop if you really design the environment well. Naturally wherever other children were.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you said there is maybe the last 10 or 15 years, you feel like you've had a lot more progress than perhaps the first, 35 or whatever that might be. I'm curious why you think that's the case. And then are there any sort of effects and observations that you've been surprised by, and any of the findings that you feel like have been a struggle to sort of translate into classroom practice?
Right. When I started working on cognitive load theory, aspects of human cognitive architecture, like the distinction between working memory and long-term memory, were well known. Okay, that occurred in 1950s, maybe 1960s. We learned that then. The distinction between biologically primary and biologically secondary skills that David Geary introduced for us is much newer. And until that distinction was made, we had a problem, because people said things like, look how easy it is
before school.
for kids to learn things outside of school. You know, they learn really complicated things like learning to listen and speak without explicit instruction. The reason they have so much difficulty learning things in school is because we try to teach them explicitly instead of just putting them in a sort of reading and writing environment. All we have to do is put them in a reading and writing environment, and they'll learn to read and write in the same way as they learn to listen and speak. Of course, that doesn't work. Sorry, what was that?
If you call them authors and they feel like authors, they'll become authors.
Yeah, that's right. Look, humanity invented reading and writing about 5,000 years ago. And for the vast bulk of that time, only a tiny proportion of any population learned how to read and write. It only became common when education became common about 150, 200 years ago.
Can I intervene here and tell you, I'm going to tell you about a person and his finding that for me have resonated with your own work and made it more significant. So Merlin Donald is another evolutionary psychologist working about the same time as you, 70s and 80s. He had a three-stage development of human beings. There's their mimetic age, before we could speak, and that was the longest, so we used gestures or whatever. And then the mythic age, it's called mythic because when we speak, we could transcend here and now. So in a sense, the past and the future are myths. But the shortest one, where we can judge by the skull is the biggest growth in our brains, was when we started writing. Then we could have a conversation, public dialectic, that not only lasted longer than our friendship, our lifetime, it just continued growing. So for the first time, knowledge could actually be built. And he saw that as humanity's victory over transient information. So that makes for me, a really incredible link with your work, especially as I heard the podcast you had a couple of months ago when you asked a number of notable educators for their most significant effect, and they all said da, 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 and you said transient information. And that's what made us as effective as human beings. Otherwise, we wouldn't have primary and secondary, because we wouldn't have writing. If we wouldn't have writing, we wouldn't have schools. You know, so it really powerfully.
But they're really good points. People forget why we invented writing. Yeah. It's to transform transient information into permanent information.
Yeah.
Listening to people, it's transient. Less transient now than it used to be, because we have recordings now. But before we had recordings, what was said just disappeared. We invented writing because it can be there forever.
Merlin Donald has a nice distinction: external symbolic storage, which is how we get information. But he also had another interesting distinction. If you imagine me here and like a dotted line just in front of me, which actually is like a desk, we capture our thoughts there on paper. So we can have, and he quotes Charles Darwin, he says, we can have longer trains of thought if we, and Paul Koshner recently wrote the difference between offloading and outsourcing. Outsourcing, you let AI do your thinking. Offloading means, here's my thought, now I'm a bit free, I can think some more thoughts, and those thoughts in front of me give me feedback during a kind of metacognitive loop. And you can, it's a clever way to transcend the limitations of working memory. So much so, he says, for all intents and purposes, that in front of you is your working memory.
Yep, that's right.
So when you go into the classroom now and you see children with their writing, I almost want to tell them, that's your mind.
Yeah.
You can do your thinking. I find that very liberating.
And most of the complex subjects that we teach in education would be utterly impossible without the permanency of writing. Can you imagine anybody being able to deal with anything close to what we call mathematics?
Yeah, no.
If you didn't have written form, until the vast majority of any population have learned to read and write, most of the subjects that we deal with, all the way from infant school up to tertiary education, utterly impossible.
Yeah.
Utterly impossible.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I asked before, and I want to sort of morph it a little bit. So that one of it, the version was, which have not maybe translated to classroom practice the way that maybe you thought it would or should. Maybe rephrase it in terms of, I think Carl Hendricks sometimes talks about lethal mutations, and are there ways in which you have seen cognitive load theory in your work sort of misrepresented, or the effects, the sort of downstream effects affecting the ways that teachers are taking it and using it in their classroom practice in schools, in ways that you wish maybe or weren't as desired, or are some sort of a, maybe not lethal mutation, maybe lethal, or something a little bit less lethal,
less productive.
Yeah.
Look, it's not just that people will sometimes misunderstand and so misuse cognitive load theory. The theory has continued to develop over decades. It's very much based on data, on empirical, on experiments, and let me give you a an example of that. In effect, I'm answering your question by saying it's not so much that other people have misunderstood cognitive load theory. We cognitive load theorists have not understood some things which turned out to be, in a sense, fatal errors until we understood them. Many years ago, we developed one of the major, arguably the most important cognitive load theory effect called the worked example effect. And that simply says, look, if you want to teach people how to solve problems, where a problem might be solving a mathematics problem, or a problem might be learning how to write an essay, the sort of thing that happens in education all the time. And we tested the hypothesis that if you give people a problem to solve and compare them to somebody who's given exactly the same problem plus a worked example to study, so one in a randomized controlled trial, one group are given problems to solve, the other group are given exactly the same problems with worked examples to study. Okay, and they get a class period or a day or however long the learning goes on for. Then you give everybody a test. And we first demonstrated the worked example effect using algebra problems. Okay, A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A. And these were secondary school kids, and we were teaching them how to do that. One group were shown a whole lot of problems like that with worked examples. The other group were given the same problems and asked to solve them themselves. Then you give everybody a test at the end, and the result we got was the worked example group did much, much better on the test. They'd learned much, much more than the problem-solving group. So that's the worked example effect. Okay, well, we did that with algebra. Then we thought, well, look, we need to replicate these things. Let's try to replicate it in other areas. And we were dealing with mathematics at that time. Let's replicate it with geometry. When exactly the same with geometry, one group given a geometry problem to solve, and another group given the same geometry problem to solve, but were shown a worked example which provided the solution. Then gave everybody a test at the end. No difference between the groups. Oh, that's funny. Let's try it elsewhere. We tried it in physics problem, and a car starts out from rest, it's accelerated, etc. What's its final velocity? No effect. And this went on for a couple of years. We've, at that point, cognitive load theory almost disappeared because, worked on algebra, didn't seem to work anywhere else. What in the world was going on? Took us a while to realize, okay, we're dealing with working memory. We explained the worked example effect in terms of working memory. You have less strain on working memory when you look at a worked example. Algebra problems, the way in which we normally structure them, are nice and straightforward. Geometry problems are different. In geometry problems, you've got a diagram. Then you have text, which might say angle ABC equals angle XYZ for such and such a reason. Imagine what you're doing when you're looking at that. You look at the diagram. You're a novice in the area. The diagram doesn't tell you much. You then look down underneath the problem, and it says angle ABC equals angle XYZ. Now, where the hell is angle ABC? So you go back. look at the diagram.
Of a split attention. Yes,
yeah, exactly.
I remember reading.
You can't look at the statement and the diagram simultaneously. You look at one, you've got to remember what's in the other one. If you read the statement, you've got to somehow remember the diagram. It's pretty difficult to do. And that's the way worked examples are traditionally set up in geometry.
I love the way that was discovered in a thought. That was really exciting. It's a real build-up of tension. Can I add to that at this particular point? There's an American educator, most of his life with children with autism, who does worked examples on the board. He does simple arithmetic.
Yeah.
What he shows, I think it's a cousin of transient information, but I'd love to know your opinion. So you do the first bit, and then I don't know, it's 59 or 27 take away 59 or something, or 29 take away 57. So there's take this off, go over there, and you do this and you do that. And then he asks his crowd of teachers who are learning, what was the second move? What was the fourth move? Because you don't know, because each move is on top of the other. So in a way, it disappears as a whole because the next bit on it. So what he does the first move, then he redraws the first move again, then does the second move, then he copies that and does the third move. So I liken it, having been involved with sports, this has been around since the 60s. Videos, and I've noted in your book, there's been some disappointment on the transformative effect, not of videos. But in sports, what they do is they have a video and they do stop motion. So you can see the video, it's over in 2 seconds, but you could break it down to 5 essential points. And that's what I think this guy, Fred Jones, you may want to have a look at him on YouTube, he's fabulous. Fred Jones, he has stop motion. Whereas when people do it one on top of the other, that's like a video. I'll show you a dance, boom, right, copy that. I'm thinking, I just didn't catch any of that. So identifying fault problems by slowing it down, really interesting.
One of the difficulties with technology is we can very easily fall into the trap of saying, oh, look, we can do this. Well, the fact that you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. There are a whole lot of things we can do with technology which we should not be doing. Let me just very briefly go back to the split attention effect. What geometry work examples look fine, providing you put the statement on the diagram itself. So you no longer have split attention between the diagram and the statement. And you do that, you suddenly get back the worked example effect. The consequences of any worked example effect depend on how you organize the instruction. So what happened there is we had the worked example effect. It disappeared on geometry. It reappeared once we reorganized the geometric examples. And the same goes everywhere else. And we were talking about the transient information effect a little while ago. We also found at one stage that geometry worked examples work better if you spoke the statements instead of having them in written form, because the statements are very brief. Angle ABC equals X, angle XYZ. It's easy to remember, and people can listen to it while they're looking at the diagram. And we then tried that with much longer statements. And of course, that didn't work because people couldn't hold the statement in working memory.
Can I come in?
Transient Information Effect was discovered. So what I'm getting at here is the theory kept developing based on data.
Getting the boundaries.
Yeah.
Can I extend the split attention effect? Now, this is because of both my experience of working with children with special needs and also my graphic background. And it links to your question about, can there be some unproductive application of some of the principles? So the idea of having labels inside the diagram, for all the reasons we know and understand, has a boundary, because we can get to a point where there are so many labels, it disrupts the clear perception of the object. And I've explored that. And interestingly, last summer, I went to my first ever cricket game at Lord's, and I went inside a building and there was a picture of 100 cricketers over his history. Now, they hadn't read your book, they wisely had the photograph or painting, and underneath they had the same painting, but only the outline with a number on the head. So you went, the painting, that's number two, that's his name. And there's lots of points at which you could miss your route, but it would still be more successful. However inefficient and difficult, it would work far more than having 100 names in that picture. So I'm interested, not because I'm perverse, but because we can avoid some of the problems in classrooms where they feel it's almost an act of faith. I must absolutely never do this because I read it in the book. But there's always boundaries, aren't there?
The boundaries to every single cognitive load theory effect, in fact, are the boundaries to every single effect in the whole area. And if you ignore those boundaries, you've got a problem.
That's so great to hear. Very hard to me.
So one of the things that that I continue to wonder about with cognitive load theory, and I'll put my cards on the table here, and you're welcome to argue with me and disagree, is that I do advocate for inquiry and not discovery learning, and I don't want to make the mistake of conflating inquiry as discovery. Guided, and I'm happy to sort of unpack that. One of the things that people will often say, and citing your work, is that it overloads cognitively the learner. And I think that can be true, but maybe isn't necessarily true. So I'm curious to explore that a little bit, and maybe in the context of the desirable difficulties. Paul Kirshner put out a piece just recently on his blog, which was highlighting contextual interference. And I thought it was really great, and it was wonderful because of the desirable difficulties. It's one that's sort of counterintuitive to cognitive load theory, right? That it's actually, we're adding tasks and we're adding context, we're adding things that ostensibly adds to the cognitive load, but there's a benefit there. So I'm curious, when you think about those desirable difficulties, and especially contextual interference, how do you think about those two things and any tension between them?
Okay. The answer to that is complex, and I need to go into another aspect of cognitive load theory, which is really central to the theory, but which I don't talk about very often because it's complicated. There's an issue called element interactivity. Some information is high in element interactivity and some is low. Let me give you an example. If you're learning the nouns of a second language, there are thousands of them, but they don't relate to each other. They don't interact. You can learn the French word for cat independently of learning the French word for dog.
Right.
And you can go all the way there. Very difficult task because there are so many nouns, but element interactivity is low. The elements don't interact. Okay. Other things, there may not be nearly as much information, but the information is completely unintelligible unless you take into account the interaction between the elements.
Mm-hmm.
If you're dealing with an algebraic equation, you have to consider all the elements of the equation simultaneously. You know, A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A. You can't just look at one part of the equation. You've got to memorize the entire equation. An expert has no trouble with doing that because they've got it up in long-term memory and they can bring the whole equation down into working memory all in one go. But the task is difficult, not because there are a lot of elements, but because of the few elements that you do have there all interact, and you can't make a change anywhere on that equation without considering every single element simultaneously. So element interactivity there is high. Now, if you introduce desirable difficulties for low element interactivity information, it works fine. If you introduce them for high element activity information, it's catastrophic. Working memory simply becomes overloaded. In other words, you can add desirable difficulties because working memory isn't being strained. If working memory is being strained, don't do it. It won't work.
Yeah, so the level of cognitive complexity is what we're looking at, right?
Yep.
Which
yep.
is another sort of paradox, at least as I see it, with something like cognitive load. Is how do we know what that cognitive complexity is? How do we know what that cognitive load is at any given moment? And there's been I don't remember the authors, but you may have seen it where and I think. Did Carl write about it? The sort of varied levels and spots along the learning spectrum or learning journey where cognitive load might go up and down, and that it's not just an average, right? It's not just one whole thing. And so, trying to get a sense, how does a teacher get a sense of what the cognitive load is or cognitive complexity at any given moment?
Or those pupils.
Yeah.
It's only in relation to a human being.
Yeah. And you've just put your finger on the major outstanding aspect of cognitive load theory that we're still working on, and we have immense difficulty there because essentially what we're saying is you as a teacher need to know what the cognitive strain is for each student at each point, because the best instruction changes depending on the cognitive load at any given point.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of work on that. The real issue is, how do you get an instantaneous measure of cognitive load at a given time?
Mm-hmm.
No easy way of doing that. At present, the best we can really say is, well, one reason a good experienced teacher is a good experienced teacher is because they've got so much knowledge they can tell, okay, here cognitive load is high and I've got to adjust for it. Here
very
quite low.
Very perceptive.
Can I just say, my colleague Tom Sherrington says the thing you can do is to create short feedback loops. So you're constantly checking how they're doing with a variety of means. So the teacher's getting constant feedback in the as often, as rapidly, as quickly, then they make those minor adjustments.
And we've in fact done experiments on that, which go They go in the following way. You give students a particular part of whatever it is you're teaching, part of a problem, part of the knowledge base. You show it to them for 5 seconds, you take it away and see if they can reproduce it. If they can reproduce it, then that element interactivity is low for them, because element interactivity doesn't just change by the nature of the material. As information goes into long-term memory, element interactivity goes down.
Yes.
For an expert mathematician, A plus B all over C equals D solve for A, that equation and its entire solution is just one element. For somebody who's just learning algebra, it's a massive number of elements. So your knowledge base determines cognitive load.
The risk of taking over, that's one more thing I wanted to explore with you, it's the notion of computation. And I go back to Herb Simon, one of the psychologists who was working early in cognitive science. He wrote a paper with Jill Larkin in 1987, which said, a picture is, brackets, sometimes worth 10,000 words. And I want to explore again another boundary of redundancy effect. And I may have misunderstood it. Redundancy is when the diagram doesn't offer any new information to what's in the text.
Or vice versa.
Indeed, yes, thank you. He had a group of people, there were science undergraduates, having a paper just with text. The other group had the text and diagrams which did not offer any more information, but they outperformed those without the diagram. So not only did they not perform less or equal, they were better. And his conclusion was the diagram was computationally advantageous because it was easier to grasp the meaning. So computation of the element interactivity, if you will, was more apparent. And Alan Paidio of dual coding theory, he says diagrams offer, they're simultaneously available. That doesn't mean you can look at a diagram and you understand it immediately, but there are many access points to understand it. Whereas with text, because it's left to right, by definition, you're adding to the cognitive load, not just information, but the syntax to make meaning of it. And so if it's depending on the nature of the information and the efficacy of the diagram can give you something that's computationally more direct access to its meaning. And so would that be a slight tweak to the redundancy effect? I've read...
Yeah, look, it is. Let's assume you're showing a diagram of a square. Okay, you look at the square, and within a split second, you know it's a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter square. You look at it, and within a second, you know exactly what it is. Now, you could, instead of showing somebody a square, say, think of the following diagram. You've got a 1 centimeter line, horizontal line. You've then got a vertical line which joins up to the horizontal line at their two ends, which is also 1 centimeter long, and it's at 90 degrees.
Yeah, etc.
etc. Now let's assume you gave one lot of people just the diagram for 2 or 3 seconds, took it away and asked them reproduce it. They could do it instantly. And let's assume for another group of people, you gave them exactly the same diagram and you gave them the text. This is a 1 centimeter, etc. If you showed them that for 1 second and asked them, "Oh, can you replicate what you've just seen?" The people who are just given the diagram, they're going to do it much, much better. the people who are given diagram and text, and I'm not sure if this corresponds to the scenario you painted before, but if it does correspond to it,
well, no, because these were
the text is redundant.
Dealing with undergraduate physics. I do it when I lead a course. I do an exercise with teachers so they understand it. I tell them there's a project which this organisation is dealing with. There are several departments, and there's Jim, who's senior, is part of it, and I describe and I ask them questions: who's in the project, who's excluded, and it's like a multi-Venn diagram. They can't do it. Then with another group, I've shown them just the diagram, and they answer immediately. So
exactly,
it's the nature of the information. Okay,
yeah. That's exactly the point I was attempting to make, and that's an exact example of it. You can give people information which is completely unnecessary, and you know it's unnecessary. They don't. They've got to read all of it in order to find out, why did I read that? I just look at the diagram and it explains everything to me. So redundancy effect is a major effect.
Yes, and this is where it could go wrong. Teachers got to where they were because they're good with words. Pretty much.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when
I see where you're going.
Teachers have to judge the complexity of element interactivity. I've got that as a principle, and obviously they go wrong often because it's they probably don't have sufficient feedback loops. I think there's a danger that they see the redundancy effect and they immediately say the diagram is decorative or superfluous. They don't consider the computational complexity of the syntax, which of course will be more now that kids read short words on screens. So they're likely given they don't. You know that thing about you don't ask fish what water is because it's all around them. They have to have not water. Well, they don't know what not understanding sentences is. It seems so obvious to them. It's in front of them. Look. So they're not best judged to look at the computational challenge of text. Therefore, the necessary program.
Yeah. Look, I used to be involved in teacher training, and one of the points I'd make to new people going out for the first time in practice teaching is, look, you're very, very familiar with whatever it is you're teaching. Don't go out into the class and in the first 5 minutes tell them everything you've ever learned in the last 5 years. It's simple for you. It's not simple for the students you're dealing with. And again, that's they're good at language. They've learnt the material, and it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
So I want to touch on the Kalyuga and Singh paper that I'm imagining you probably are familiar with or seen, and you'll tell me if you're not, but Rethinking the Boundaries of Cognitive Load Theory and Complex Learning. One of the things that really stood out to me in there is that they are looking at perhaps an alternative view, and this is kind of relates to the work that I like to advocate for, in addition to explicit instruction, but using inquiry in ways that is something more like that complex learning. And so they're talking about, thinking differently, and perhaps through as we think about cognitive load theory, and the cognitive load and the ways that inquiry can affect that. And one of the things that I think can be a really powerful sort of dynamic and tool to use in learning, and you have to be careful with it. And I'm curious to have you disabuse me of this idea completely, is starting with inquiry, like a question. And Jared Cooney Horvath, who's a neuroscientist getting some notoriety here about digital delusion in screens, he had written a blog piece and used the question, which I thought was certainly a good one. In what way are justice and fairness alike? And using that as sort of a framing. And I think that's what the Kalyuga and Singh paper is sort of alluding to, is that there can be a use of inquiry that can frame and sort of set the scene, almost like a mental map of sorts, that then when you get into the explicit instruction and that knowledge building, that it might be a little bit more traction, if that makes sense, of sort of the gap between where a student might be and where you want them to go. How slippery is that, and how do we get them a little bit more traction so that they can close that gap a little more quickly? And my experience in the way that I think about using inquiry is that it can have some sort of an effect like that. And I'm curious, does it make sense to you, or completely disabuse me of that idea?
Yeah. Look, this goes back to element interactivity, or informational complexity. There's no problem at all beginning with inquiry if element interactivity, if complexity is low.
Right.
If it's high, it's catastrophic.
And I would agree. Yeah.
You can't.
And that's cognitive load theory primarily deals with high element interactivity information. And people who say, oh, look, you can start off with inquiry, and yeah, you can if it's low in element interactivity, if it's low complexity information. If it's high complexity information, don't do it. We've got lots of published data on exactly that, recent data. In fact, some of it very recent data, the last year or two. There's no problem starting off with problem solving or inquiry whatsoever if you're dealing with low element interactivity, low complexity information. There may be a lot of information, but if it doesn't interact, that's fine. If it's highly interactive, don't do it. Give them an example right from the beginning and spell it all out.
In terms of your metaphor.
Sorry.
So you were saying Drew was giving a metaphor about slippery and footholes. You need those holes first of all, don't you?
Yep.
Yeah, and I advocate for that as well, and am quick to criticize and push back on the more sort of progressive inquiry side, who says, oh, we don't need knowledge, or we're not really supposed to teach. So recognizing and thinking about that cognitive complexity, as a former social studies teacher, I might ask my students, which of the U.S. amendments would you recommend getting rid of at high school? But I wouldn't at a fourth grade level, right? Because it would be just so far out of their reach. It would be impossible for them to understand. I mean, it would take years, and literally 5 to 10 years to get them into high school age, right?
Yeah. And it's something which you can deal with that, but you deal with it directly, explicitly for those people. For other people who are more knowledgeable, that knowledge is the base of critical thinking, of creativity. Expecting somebody to be creative and critical, engaging in critical thought when they have almost no understanding what they're dealing with, it's hopeless.
Yeah, I agree with that. I sometimes make the qualification that and this gets outside of the critical thinking as a domain specific skill, whether it seems to me there's something that's more generalized, and we don't need to litigate that here, but that you can do critical thinking without knowledge, but it's just not going to be high quality. It's just going to be vacuous, right? We do need that knowledge, and once you get that knowledge, the critical thinking becomes much more high quality. Are there things in your mind, in terms of, like, when I think about explicit instruction and some of the advocacy and messaging that I see And I think, again, Carl Hendrick has written about this just most recently, is that it can be really easy to fall into that trap of, I've taught it, they've given me the answer, they have an understanding of it. And there's a difference between that and what I would call making meaning of it. You can say first order reality and second order reality. First order reality is what the teacher says it is, and second order is what you make of it, which has all your context and what you bring to it and what you were thinking of at the time. And that might change a week later or things like that. So I really emphasize the sort of process of making meaning and having students make meaning of it, which is, kind of gets us back to the beginning of the conversation where you're talking about the lines and turning it into the words. Now you've got meaning, and that is, you have more retrieval cues, you've got more connections, neural connections, or however you want to frame it. And so, I wonder how you think about that difference between sort of external scaffolding as done by the teacher versus sort of an internal scaffolding as done by the student, of course, with the significant guidance and help and support of the teacher.
Yeah, in effect, what we're talking about here is what is or is not in long-term memory. If there's something in long-term memory, if the scaffolding has already been provided and you've got the entire concept in long-term memory, you can start thinking about it. You can start going off in directions which you couldn't dream of doing otherwise. If it's not in long-term memory, you can't do that. First, you've got to get it into long-term memory, and for complicated material, by which I mean high element interactivity, the elements all interact with each other. For that sort of material, and again, I need to emphasize that's the sort of thing that cognitive load theory is primarily concerned with. For that sort of material, you need to begin with explicit teaching. Having inquiry learning there, I'll get there eventually, but life is finite, and
Yeah.
I don't know if this helps, Drew, but I'm doing a project with an American national basketball coach and an Australian professor of skill acquisition. And they're looking at the problem of they can organize drills and doing the basketball, it goes perfectly. And when they go into a game, damn it, those opponents, they mess everything up.
Yeah.
So there need to be some invention, adaptability thinking, but they're working from their skill bases, and then they combine in novel ways, which you have mentioned, haven't you? So that novel combinations.
Yeah. That's precisely it. That's precisely it. Yes.
Yeah, my daughter and I were watching, I went to Michigan State University, and so we watched Michigan State basketball together, and one of the guys, very good shooter in the game is, I don't know, maybe 30%, and I was telling her a story of how he had made 22 three-pointers in practice in a row, and she said, well, how come he doesn't do that in the game? I said, well... There's a number of reasons, but I think and Oliver and I think we've gone back and forth on social media about this sort of coaching, because I coach as well, and this is again one of those things that I think it's a frustration for me, because the people who are sort of advocating so strongly for explicit instruction, again, which I'm an advocate for explicit instruction, I want to make that clear. But they tend to me, sort of be in this sort of rigid, narrow mindset of really building this knowledge and building, these sort of discrete things. And it might be in athletics, it's drills, right? It's building those skills. And I feel like they're not recognizing that there are other dimensions to learning and thinking, and perhaps even other desirable academic outcomes other than just the sort of recall of knowledge and long-term memory and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Look, the distinctions that occur as a consequences of differences in element interactivity, differences in complexity, they're ignored. And that's why we have this problem. The way you handle, the way you teach low element interactivity information is different, vastly different to the way you handle, the way you teach high element interactivity instruction. And this is something that the field has to place more emphasis on. It's been ignored.
Yeah, it's a message from this podcast. Very strong.
Yeah. If people take one message from this podcast, I hope that's it.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Well, it's the ways in which we think about and use research, yours included. I think you have to be really careful. I know there's trouble replicating things. There's examples that you've had in your research where things didn't turn out the way that you might have expected, and sometimes sort of exploratory or something more like discovery learning might perform as similar to explicit instruction, and you think, well, what the heck's happening here? There's so many variables, right? There's so many different things, and being informed by the evidence, being informed by the research, but not being sort of driven by it in a way that's algorithmic as opposed to sort of heuristically, right? That we're seeing this sort of direction of things, and we're making progress in the ways that we understand these things, but it's not quite the way that an algorithm would want us to sort of behave and respond. So. Oliver, you have anything you want to say before we let John go?
Your paper 20 years later that you gave general degree, was it about 5 years or so years ago, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
7 years ago, even. I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you.
A real help. That was really help. So I've had a long study of Alan Pivio, and I've read him in details and how he looks at linear, non-linear, and he talks about haptics. So it's not verbal and visual, it's verbal and all the non-linear aspects in which we learn. And the tracing of whose PhD was incorporated. It's more holistic, and we can see various roots and nuances. I thought that helped enormously. And really, that's what I tell people who misuse your work by not knowing enough. I'd say, one, read that paper 20 years later and come away with the one message. Look closely at the complexity of the element interactivity and see whether you are or aren't making adjustments to how you teach. Yeah.
It's absolutely critical, and it's something we have ignored, and it accounts for just so many contradictions or apparent contradictions which disappear once you take into account, this is high element of activity, and the way you teach that, it should be completely different to the way you teach low element interactivity information. When I give a summary of cognitive load theory, I tend to ignore element interactivity because it's so hard to explain. In future podcasts, I think I'm going to have to include it, whether it's hard to explain or not. So.
Yeah, well, it's been a real honor to meet you and hear you talk and expand and share your thinking. That was really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation as well, and I'll sort of echo some of the things that I think for educators, Oliver, building on your thinking, is some intellectual humility and really sort of trying to, how can we move away from this sort of tribal lens that, it's either explicit instruction or, this dichotomy, and think about what are the ways that we can consider the evidence and have dialectic conversation to figure out what the best pieces are going forward, and figure out, hey, how can I be wrong for as short a time as possible? Because that's the sort of scientific process. But John, if there's anything you want to say before we sign off, any place you want them to visit or go or anything like that, now's your time.
No, that's fine. look, like to thank both of you for a really good conversation. It's been. I hope it's been useful to you. It's certainly been useful to me. So thank you very much.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.